George William Russell and his kundalini experience. George William Russell, better known as A.E., 1867 to 1935, was an Irish mystic, a poet, painter, journalist, editor, and practical rural economist. He was a pivotal figure in the Irish literary revival and in the emergence of modern Ireland. From the beginning of the 20th century, he formed lifelong friendships with W.B. Yeats, George Moore, Lord Dunsany, James Stephens, Stephen McKenna, the translator of the Aeneads of Plotinus, James Joyce, shown here, and other writers, thinkers and artists, and was closely associated with the Irish National Theatre Society, later the Abbey Theatre. Although he was a natural mystic, he had one brush with the kundalini experience, and it was enough to make him realise he didn't need it or want it. As such, he is somewhat unique, as he managed to ensure it never happened again. Furthermore, he managed to do an enormous amount without having had such an experience, making a huge difference in a very quiet way to both literary and political life in Ireland. A.E. George Russell. Whilst I could comprehend a little about the nature of the psyche, I could not apprehend at all the spirit which transcends the soul, for as Sears said of it, it is eternal, invisible, and universal. Yet because it is universal, we are haunted by it in every moment of mind. Seeing other realms. It was probably in mid-1884 that Russell quite suddenly began to experience waking dreams of astonishing power and vividness. Images of cosmic happenings and other worlds overwhelmed him with a majesty far removed from anything of which he was aware in his own being. Then one summer day he lay on Kilmasheoch, one of the hills just south of Dublin, and with great intensity he felt the presence of supernatural beings. George William Russell. The heart of the hills was open to me, and I knew there was no hill for those who were there, and they were unconscious of the ponderous mountains piled above the palaces of light, and the winds were sparkling and diamond clear, yet full of colour, as an opal, as they glittered through the valley, and I knew the golden age was all about me. And it was we who had been blind to it, but that it had never passed away from the world. But not only did George William Russell see beings of light, he heard celestial music as well. A.E. George Russell. I found later, if meditation on the spirit is prolonged and profound enough, we enter on a state where our being is musical. Not a music heard without, but felt within, as if the soul itself had become music, or had drawn nigh to the ray of the master singer, and was for that instant part of the multitudinous. Kundalini. It was to Russell's interest in the Hindu systems that we owe an understanding of what a disaster their approach had on him. Without any meditation or alternative spiritual practices, Russell had already seen the beings of light, heard celestial music, and received great swathes of inspiration for his poetry and paintings. And indeed his paintings were in great demand. Many of his exhibitions were sold out. But, ever curious, he made a mistake. Colin Wilson, from Mysteries. In 1889, when he was 22, Russell gave up art. He told Yeats it would weaken his will, and joined the Theosophical Society, apparently uninfluenced by the widespread belief that Madame Blavatsky was a fake. 5 years earlier, a housekeeper with a grudge had exposed her employer in a Bombay magazine, asserting that various psychic effects were achieved by trickery. Not long before, it had been discovered that parts of the famous Mahatma letters, supposedly dedicated by a supernatural being called Kutumi, were lifted from the work of an American spiritualist, Henry Giddle. But in spite of the scandal, Russell and Yeats became theosophists. An article on Russell's primeval language had been published in the Theosophist 2 years before. Now, Russell began to practice the Hindu system of meditation, deliberately attempting to arouse the spirit force, kundalini. He describes how, once at the apex of intensest meditation, I awoke that fire in myself, of which the ancients have written, and it ran like lightning up my spinal cord, and my body rocked with the power of it, and I seemed to myself to be standing in a fountain of flame, and there were fiery pulsations as of wings about my head, and a musical sound, not unlike the clashing of cymbals with every pulsation. He suddenly recalled the danger involved in the awakening of this power, that in one who was not completely purified could turn downward and vitalize his darker passions and awaken strange frenzies and inextinguishable desires, and deliberately refrained from attempting any more. His friend H.W. Nevinson asserted that he had twice seen Russell deliver a speech when possessed by this power and could see lights and hear voices. Afterwards, Russell could no longer remember what he said. Eventually, he ceased to attempt to arouse the kundalini power. His natural powers of vision were enough. J. B. Priestley, margin released. Russell was far from being great in painting, poetry, criticism, yet he was undoubtedly a great man, a triumphant proof of the idea that so long as a man guards against intolerance and anger, it is better to believe in too much than to believe in too little. He was one of those who seemed to spend a life with us almost in innocent bewilderment, because they come from some larger, nobler race. He had some economic and political ideas that are not behind our time, but ahead of it. He proved himself a more practical man than the hard-headed realists, and during the years when Ireland was at war with the British government, and then with herself, it was to this seer, this poet and painter of gods, demigods, angels and fairies, that men turned in the dark and confusion, aware then of his strength, his steadfastness. One of his favourite beliefs was that in this age we have disinherited ourselves. As he wrote to a friend, we have imagined ourselves into littleness, darkness, and ignorance, and we have to imagine ourselves back into light. That was 30 years ago. Nothing much has happened since to prove he was wrong.